What if I told you that in winter on the frontier, gold was valued less than a can of ordinary, foul-smelling fat? In the bitter cold, when temperatures dropped to the limits of human endurance, it was this white substance that became the main treasure. It did not shine, sparkle, or inspire admiration, but it could give you another day of life in a place where even metal turned to ice. In the vastness of the Wild West, where the cold came suddenly and mercilessly, fat became the currency of survival. Pioneers, trappers, and indigenous peoples studied its properties for centuries, discovering secrets that would seem crazy to modern people. They knew that fat could replace warm clothing, become fuel that did not crack or go out in the wind, and a medicine that drew the frost from frost-bitten limbs. In their hands, this humble resource was transformed into a mobile energy reserve that could be rubbed on the skin, stored for months, and used at any moment when nature declared war on humans. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a piece of fat could save an entire family from death at night, why fat was considered a strategic resource for every winter expedition, and how people turned it into the last but most reliable barrier between themselves and the icy void. Are you ready to learn the truth about how people survived without down jackets and thermal underwear? The most unexpected use of animal fat was to apply it directly to the human body. In severe frosts, when the wind penetrated homespun clothing, a layer of fat became a life-saving insulation. Mountain hunters and travelers generously smeared their faces, hands, and even chests with a thick layer of bear or goose fat. This created an impermeable film that trapped moisture inside the skin and prevented the cold from reaching living tissue. This method was borrowed from indigenous tribes who had lived in harmony with the harsh nature of the plains for centuries. The Indians knew that bare skin was vulnerable in the cold, but that skin saturated with fat became resistant to wind and snow. Pioneers quickly adopted this habit, despite the specific smell and discomfort of the sticky substance. The layer of fat acted as an extra layer of clothing that could not be lost or torn. It protected exposed areas of the face from frostbite much more effectively than any scarf of the time. In addition, the fat on the body protected the skin from drying out in the low humidity of the winter air. Cracks on the hands and lips could become gateways for infection, which was deadly dangerous far from doctors. The oily film kept the skin elastic, allowing people to work with rough tools and ropes. It was a primitive but extremely effective cosmetic means of survival. Even on the coldest nights when the fire in the hearth was dying out, this invisible sweater continued to warm the sleeping person. However, the use of fat was not limited to external application because the body needed warmth from within. On the coldest days, men drank melted fat by the mugful, as if it were hot tea or coffee. This provided a huge boost of calories, which the body immediately converted into heat energy. The feeling of cold receded when the internal boiler received such powerful fuel. It was believed that a spoonful of pure fat warmed better than the warmest woolen blankets. For many settlers, this ritual was a daily necessity, without which it was impossible to leave the hut. They mixed fat with hot water or simply swallowed it in chunks if there was no time to melt it. This contradicts all modern dietary norms, but at that time it was a matter of survival. The body adapted to this diet, turning into a fat-burning machine. Without this additional source of energy, a person would simply freeze to death in their sleep. It is important to note that not all fat obtained from hunting was suitable for this purpose. Internal fat was particularly valued because it was softer and easier for the human body to digest. It was carefully separated from the meat and stored in special birch bark containers or clay pots. The loss of such a supply in the middle of winter was perceived as a real tragedy for the whole group. People cherished it more than gunpowder because it was impossible to shoot in the cold with numb hands. It was especially difficult for those who disdained such methods because of their upbringing or city habits. Frontier history knows many examples of proud settlers dying from the cold, refusing to smear themselves with savage ointments. Those who cast aside their prejudices had a chance to see the next spring. Adaptation required abandoning familiar hygiene norms in order to survive. The smell of rancid lard became the smell of life itself in these harsh lands. Over time, even women and children in the settlements got used to the need to use fat as a protective cream. Before going outside, mothers carefully smeared their children's cheeks and noses. It became as routine as putting on a hat or mittens before going for a walk. No one paid attention to the greasy shine on their faces because it was a sign of prudence and experience. It was a culture born of the need to withstand the merciless elements. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Would you be able to overcome your aversion and smear yourself with a thick layer of grease to keep from freezing? Or would you rather take the risk? Write about it in the comments. Want to know a secret that will change your life if you suddenly find yourself without electricity? In winter on the frontier, night fell early and darkness became as much an enemy as the cold. The only available source of light for most pioneers was candles and lamps made from the same animal fat. On long winter evenings, when the blizzard howled outside the walls, it was fat that gave people the light of hope. Candle making was an important autumn ritual in which the whole family, young and old, participated. Beef or sheep fat, known as hard fat, was most often used to make candles. It had to be melted down for a long time in large cauldrons over a low heat, removing impurities and pieces of meat. The smell was distinctive, permeating clothes and hair, but no one complained. The purified fat turned white and hard when it solidified, which was necessary for a good candle. It was a laborious process that required patience and precision. The easiest way was to make so-called dipped candles, where the wick was repeatedly dipped into hot fat. Women tied dozens of cotton wicks to a stick and rhythmically dipped them into a pot of melted lard. With each dip, a thin layer of fat accumulated on the wick until the candle reached the desired thickness. This required skill to ensure that the layers were even and the candle was not crooked. In one day, an experienced housewife could make a supply of candles for several months. If there was not enough time or skill, special molds made of tin or even simple wood were used. The wick was placed in the mold, hot fat was poured in, and then it was left to cool and harden completely. Such candles turned out to be more even and beautiful, but the molds cost money and not everyone had them. Therefore, remote ranches often relied on the old-fashioned dipping method. Each such candle was worth its weight in gold during the dark winter months. However, tallow candles had one significant drawback that had to be tolerated. They burned faster than wax candles, smoked heavily, and emitted a rather unpleasant smell of burnt fat. In cramped dugouts and huts, this smell mixed with the smoke from the hearth, creating a heavy atmosphere. To reduce the smoke, the wick had to be constantly trimmed with special scissors. If the candle was not monitored, it could quickly melt and spoil. Where it was not possible to make proper candles, so-called fat lamps or bowls were used. These were simple containers filled with any available fat in which a piece of moss or a rag wick floated. Such lamps gave off a dim, flickering light and even more smoke than candles, but they allowed the use of even soft, low-quality fat that was unsuitable for solid candles. This was the light of the poor and travelers caught on the road at night. Light in the house in winter had not only practical, but also enormous psychological significance for the settlers. It dispelled the darkness, allowed them to read the Bible, mend clothes, and simply see the faces of their loved ones. Darkness was oppressive, causing fear and a feeling of hopelessness in the endless snowy desert. The small flame of a tallow lamp was a symbol of civilization and comfort in the midst of wild nature. It reminded people that they were still human beings, not wild animals in a burrow. Sometimes, to improve the quality of the candles, beeswax was added to the fat if a wild beehive could be found. The mixture of wax and lard burned brighter, longer, and smelled much nicer than pure fat. Such candles were saved for special occasions, holidays, or when guests came to visit. Ordinary weekdays were lit by the dim light of simple melted lard. This was the everyday reality of life, devoid of romance. Fat reserves for lighting were calculated as strictly as food reserves for the winter. Running out of light in mid-January meant spending 1,416 hours a day in complete darkness. People went to bed at sunset and got up at dawn to save this precious resource. Life was governed by the rhythm of the burning tallow candle. In the next chapter, you will learn how this same material helped prevent clothing from turning into an icy shell. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as inhumane, but back then it was the norm. I am talking about impregnating clothing and footwear, without which any outing in the snow would result in wet feet and frostbite. The pioneers' leather shoes and clothing quickly became wet from melting snow, becoming heavy and icy. To avoid this, the settlers created unique water-repellent mixtures based on animal fat. It was real frontier chemistry, where each ingredient played a vital role. The basis of this impregnation, often called dabbing, was always melted beef fat or lard. The fat penetrated deep into the pores of natural leather, filling them and preventing water from being absorbed. However, pure lard could harden and crack in the cold and melt and leak in the heat. Therefore, beeswax and, if possible, coniferous tree resin were always added to the fat. The resulting mixture was cooked for a long time over low heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spatula. The process of applying this ointment to shoes was a whole ritual that was performed regularly, sometimes every evening. Boots or moccasins first had to be thoroughly dried by the fire, but in such a way that the leather did not dry out. Then the hot fat mixture was rubbed into the leather with hands or a piece of woolen cloth with great effort. Particular attention was paid to the seams, through which water penetrated most quickly. After such treatment, the leather darkened, became soft and elastic, but most importantly, it became completely waterproof. Water rolled off such boots in drops, unable to soak into the material. This allowed hunters and lumberjacks to spend the whole day in the snow while keeping their feet dry. Dry feet in winter meant no colds and preserved toes. Pioneers impregnated not only their shoes with fat, but also their pants, jackets, and even hats made of leather or thick fabric. The trappers' leather jackets, shiny with fat and dirt, looked untidy but were functional. Such a greasy cloak was windproof and did not get wet in wet snow or rain. The smell from such a person was appropriate. But on the frontier, people were judged not by their smell, but by their ability to survive. There were dozens of recipes for such mixtures, and each family kept it secret for the perfect impregnation. Some added tar to the fat to protect against rot, while others used bear fat for greater softness. These recipes were passed down from father to son as a valuable inheritance. Knowing how to keep clothes dry was more important than knowing how to read or write. Native American tribes taught pioneers to use animal brains mixed with fat to waterproof hides. This method, called brain tanning, made suede incredibly durable and resistant to moisture. Clothes made from such leather remained soft even after repeated wetting and drying. White settlers often adopted this practice, recognizing the superiority of local techniques. Clothing impregnated with fat had another unexpected advantage in the harsh conditions of the Wild West. It was so slippery and dense that it was difficult to grab in hand-to-hand combat or with the claws of a beast. Of course, this was a side effect, but in the dangerous world of the frontier, any little thing could save a life. However, water remained the main enemy, and fat was the only reliable shield against it. Caring for equipment with grease was a never-ending process that took up all my free evenings. A lazy person who forgot to grease their boots in the evening would pay for it in the morning with ice blocks on their feet. Discipline in caring for things was strict because there was simply nowhere to buy new boots in the wilderness. Grease extended the life of items by decades, allowing one pair of boots to be worn for years. Sometimes, if there was no impregnation at hand, they simply used a piece of raw lard, which they rubbed into the surface of the leather. It was a temporary solution, but it worked in an emergency. The ability to find uses for simple things distinguished a true survivor. Like this, if you also believe that simple solutions are often the most ingenious. What if I told you that the best pharmacy was not at the doctor's office, but in a jar of fat? In the absence of professional medical care, animal fat became the basis for most medicinal ointments and remedies. Goose fat was considered the most valuable and was carefully collected and stored as a remedy for colds and coughs. At the first signs of illness, the patient's chest and back were rubbed generously with warm goose fat, then wrapped in wool. It was believed that this deeply warmed the lungs and drove the disease out. Skunk fat was no less popular, and despite its origin, was highly valued for its penetrating properties. Pioneers believed that skunk oil could penetrate deep into the tissues and treat inflammation of muscles and joints. It was used for rheumatism, which often afflicted people living in damp and cold homes. The process of extracting this fat required special skill so as not to spoil the product with the animal's protective fluid. The fat also served as the basis for healing ointments with the addition of herbs and roots. Pine resin, plantain, or calendula were added to melted fat to make a thick balm. This remedy was used to treat cuts, burns, and abrasions, which were inevitable during hard physical labor. The oily base prevented the bandage from sticking to the wound and created a protective barrier against dirt. Protection against frostbite, which was a constant threat in winter, was particularly important. If a person had already suffered mild frostbite, the affected area was carefully lubricated with unsalted fat. This helped to restore blood circulation and soften the damaged skin, preventing tissue necrosis. It was strictly forbidden to rub frostbitten areas with snow, as many mistakenly believe. Only fat was used. A mixture of fat and honey, if available on the farm, was used to treat chapped lips and hands. It was a primitive but effective cosmetic and therapeutic remedy for the whole family. Frontier women knew dozens of fat-based recipes for maintaining the beauty and health of their skin. In conditions of constant wind and sun, an unprotected face quickly turned into a rough mask. In some cases, fat was even used as a laxative for digestive problems. A spoonful of warm oil or liquid fat could solve the problem caused by a monotonous winter diet. It was an unpleasant but effective treatment available to everyone. Frontier medicine was crude, practical, and unsentimental. Trappers often used bear fat to treat insect bites and minor wounds on their dogs. Caring for animals was as important as caring for people, because without dogs and horses, it was impossible to survive in the mountains. The versatility of the fat made it an indispensable component of any traveler's first aid kit. A small jar of ointment always hung from the belt or lay in the saddlebag. There were also more exotic uses, such as instilling warm fat into the ear for ear infections. It was believed that heat and fat relieved pain and inflammation. Although from a modern point of view, this is doubtful. But when the nearest doctor is 300 miles away, people grasp at any opportunity to ease their suffering. The belief in the healing power of nature and simple remedies was unshakable. Knowledge about the healing properties of fats was often borrowed from Native American shamans and healers. White settlers quickly learned to distinguish which animal fat was best suited for a particular illness. Badger fat, for example, was also considered a powerful remedy for strengthening the immune system and treating the lungs. This experience was accumulated over decades and passed down from generation to generation. Fat was not just food or fuel, it was a substance that gave and preserved life in all its manifestations. In the next chapter, you will learn how it was used to keep meat fresh for months without refrigeration. Preserving food in winter was no less difficult than obtaining it, and fat played a key role in this. In the harsh conditions of the frontier, cold was an unreliable ally. Blizzards could be followed by thaws, and food hidden simply in the cold would spoil. Therefore, the pioneers used a method that today would be called confit, but at the time was considered simply a necessity. Pieces of roasted meat were tightly packed into clay pots or wooden barrels and poured over with hot melted fat, making sure that not even the slightest air bubble remained. As it solidified, the fat formed a dense, cast-like, airtight lid that was impervious to air and moisture. This method was so effective that it was considered a guarantee of surviving the long winter. In such an airless space, bacteria could not multiply, and the meat did not spoil even at above zero temperatures. This solved the main problem, the lack of stable frosts and storage facilities. This method allowed people to preserve pork, venison, or bear meat until spring and even longer, turning one successful hunting day into months of satiety. When it was time to prepare dinner, the hostess simply scraped a thick monolith of fat and meat with a wooden spoon, threw it into a frying pan, and the fat melted again, turning into a gravy. Such a dinner was hearty, aromatic, and ready in a matter of minutes. A real treat after a long day of work. In conditions of unstable hunting, this was indispensable. The famous pemmican, borrowed from the Indians, also relied exclusively on the preservative properties of fat. Sun-dried meat was ground into powder so that it contained no moisture or fibers that could mold. The meat was then mixed with melted fat and sometimes dried berries in a 1-to-1 ratio to produce a dense, rich mixture. The fat enveloped each particle, as if enclosing it in an invisible film. This combination prevented oxidation and made the product virtually eternal. Pemmican was stored for years, retaining its taste and nutritional value. Pemmican was the ideal food for travel, as it took up a minimum of space but provided maximum energy. Even one person could carry it on their belt, in a pouch, or in a saddlebag. A small piece of this mixture provided an adult man with strength for long hours of hard travel. It was indispensable on winter expeditions when hunting yielded little prey. Trappers and scouts always carried a supply of pemmican for a rainy day, and this supply often saved lives. Without such an invention, the exploration of the vast expanses of the West would have been virtually impossible. Not only meat was covered with fat, but also homemade sausages, so that they would not dry out or mold. To do this, the sausage rings were carefully placed in barrels and completely covered with melted lard so that there were no gaps between the products. In winter, such barrels were kept in cold porches or cellars, where sausages could be stored for months. Sometimes families made special boxes buried in the ground to keep the temperature stable. Opening a new barrel of supplies was always a small celebration, especially after several weeks of monotonous food. It was the taste of real wealth. They even tried to preserve eggs by coating their shells with fat to seal the pores. This thin layer prevented moisture, evaporation, and bacteria from entering. When stored properly, eggs could last for a couple of months, which was considered a great success for the winter. Such methods were especially valued during the period when chickens stopped laying and fresh eggs became a rarity. In conditions of scarcity, every clever method was worth its weight in gold. Fat helped people survive the long winter weeks when fresh food was unavailable. Fat was also used to preserve certain vegetables, especially root vegetables, by baking them first. The baked vegetables were layered in pots and covered with melted lard, turning them into a semi-prepared meal. This created a hearty and convenient dish that remained soft and tasty even after weeks. All you had to do was reheat it in the oven or on the stove. This approach saved time, firewood, and energy, because in winter, every little thing mattered. The rational use of resources was the basis for the survival of the household. Fat for preservation was prepared in the fall, during the mass slaughter of livestock or the hunting season. These days, the farm was bustling with activity. Women, men, children. Everyone was busy. The fat was melted in large cast iron pots over low heat, carefully skimming off the foam and filtering out impurities. The fate of the entire winter pantry depended on its purity. One spoiled pot could mean weeks of lost labor. Therefore, the process was taken very seriously. Thus, fat served as a natural plastic, sealant, and preservative all at once. It bound, protected, preserved, and prolonged the life of the supplies that were the family's insurance against hunger. In conditions of snowstorms and inhuman cold, such reserves were a matter of survival, not convenience. The ability to properly preserve food was valued more highly than the ability to shoot accurately or drive a horse. It was a craft passed down from generation to generation. Fat became the basis of winter well-being. In the next chapter, you will learn how fat help mechanisms work in conditions where metal became brittle from the cold. Where ordinary lubricants froze solid, fat remained flexible and saved both people and machines. This role was no less important than the role of fat in nutrition. It provided movement, work, and warmth. And without movement, the frontier simply could not exist. Ready to find out why the wagons didn't stop even at -40? The mechanisms on which the pioneers' lives depended required lubrication no less than people needed food. In extreme cold, ordinary oils thickened and turned into glue, blocking the movement of wheels and the operation of weapons. The pioneers learned to create special lubricants based on animal fat, which remained pliable in the cold. By mixing fat with tar obtained from pine stumps, they obtained a universal wheel grease. This black, sticky substance was applied to the axles of wagons and carts, allowing the wheels to turn even in deep snow. Without such lubrication, the metal would rub against wood or metal with a terrible squeak and rapid wear. A broken axle in the middle of a snowy plain would mean certain death for the settlers. Therefore, a bucket of tar grease always hung under the bottom of every wagon in the Wild West. Firearms, which were the only means of defense and obtaining food, required special attention. Ordinary grease could freeze in severe cold and stick the rifle's firing mechanism shut. Experienced shooters used the most liquid and pure oil for lubrication, such as bone fat or hoof oil. It was applied in a very thin layer, just lightly wiping the parts with an oiled rag. Sometimes, to obtain a non-freezing lubricant, the fat was mixed with kerosene, if available. Such a mixture remained liquid even at very low temperatures and penetrated well into all parts of the mechanism. But more often than not, people had to rely on the natural properties of certain types of fat. Bear fat, for example, was famous for not thickening in the cold for a long time and was therefore highly valued. Fat was used to lubricate saws and axes so that they would cut through frozen wood more easily and not rust. The work of a lumberjack in winter was hellish, and any way to make the tool slide more easily was important. A lubricated blade got stuck less in resinous wood, saving the worker's strength. Tools were cherished as there was nothing to replace them with in the wilderness. Door hinges, locks, and bolts also required regular lubrication to prevent them from freezing shut. In severe frosts, the metal would become covered with frost, and without a layer of grease, opening the door to the izba could become a problem. Every morning, the owner of the house would walk around the property, checking the mobility of all mechanisms. This was part of the daily routine of survival, which is rarely written about in books. Fat was also used to lubricate the leather harnesses of horses and mules. The straps stiffened in the cold and could break or rub the animal's skin until it bled. Regular rubbing with fat kept the harness soft and flexible, which was critical for transportation. Taking care of the equipment was equivalent to taking care of one's own life. Trappers used fat to treat their snares and traps. This not only protected the metal from rust, but also masked the smell of iron, which could scare away cautious animals. A properly prepared trap was the key to successful hunting and therefore survival. There were no small details in this business. Animal fat was the universal technical fluid of the era, replacing machine oil, grease, and WD-40. It kept civilization moving forward, its wheels creaking on the frozen ground of the frontier. The ability to prepare the right lubricant was as important a skill as the ability to drive horses. In the next chapter, we will talk about how fat became a commodity and a currency.
2 jars of prime rendered fat.
All right, that'll cover the axe head and the flour.
Much obliged.
Animal fat on the frontier was not only a means of survival, but also a hard currency that could be exchanged for any goods. Bear fat was especially highly prized, as it was considered the best quality of all available types. Trappers who caught a bear were happy not only with the skin, but also with the huge amount of fat that could be rendered. A barrel of pure bear fat at a trading post could cost more than several good beaver skins. This product was in demand not only in the Wild West, but also in eastern cities where it was used in cosmetics. Fashionistas in New York and Boston bought hair pomades based on bear fat, believing in its miraculous power. It was believed to promote hair growth and prevent baldness in men. Therefore, the supply of fat from the frontier was a well-established and profitable business. The fat trade allowed hunters to buy gunpowder, lead, flour, and coffee, goods that could not be obtained in the forest. The Indians also actively participated in this exchange, bringing buffalo tallow and bone fat to the posts. For them, it was a way to obtain metal tools, pots, and fabrics. Fat was a universal language of trade, understood by all cultures in the region. The quality of the fat was strictly assessed by buyers. It had to be clean, without the smell of burning or blood impurities. White, grainy fat was more expensive than gray or yellow fat that had been melted down haphazardly. The skill of melting fat directly affected the income of hunters and settlers. This encouraged people to improve their processing techniques right in the field. In addition to bear fat, the fat of raccoons, badgers, and even skunks was in demand for medical purposes. Each species had its own niche in the market and its own buyer. Apothecaries bought specific fats for making ointments, and soap makers bought any cheap fat in bulk. The frontier economy was largely based on the processing of natural resources. Transporting fat was a difficult task. Airtight containers were needed to prevent the product from spoiling and leaking. Wooden barrels, clay pots, and even the bladders of large animals were used, as the Indians did. Keeping the containers intact on bumpy roads was a headache for traders. Fat was often used as a medium of exchange in small transactions between neighbors. A jar of good lard could be exchanged for a neighbor's help with roof repairs or borrowing tools. It was an understandable and sought-after unit of measurement for labor and gratitude. In a world where paper money was often worthless, a real product was more reliable. In years of famine, the price of fat skyrocketed, becoming more expensive than silver. Those who had stocks of lard could dictate their terms and feel like kings. The accumulation of fat was a form of savings that guaranteed the future well-being of the family. The fat rush was not as noticeable as the gold rush, but it was more stable and vital. It created trade links, uniting remote settlements and large cities. Without this slippery currency, the frontier economy would simply have stalled. The process of obtaining fat, or rendering, was one of the most labor-intensive and dirty stages of life on a farm or in a camp. Usually, special days were set aside for this in the fall, when cattle were slaughtered or when people returned from a big hunt. Huge bonfires were lit in the yard, on which the largest cast iron cauldrons available on the farm were placed. The smell of melting suet spread for miles around, attracting predators and neighbors. The raw fat first had to be thoroughly chopped, cutting it into small cubes or passing it through a meat grinder. The smaller the pieces, the faster and more completely the fat melted. The whole family participated in this. The men chopped, the women and children cut. The work was monotonous and hands quickly became greasy and slippery, but it was impossible to stop. The chopped fat was loaded into cauldrons, adding a little water to prevent the fat from burning at the very beginning of the process. The fire under the cauldron had to be kept even and not too strong. If the fat overheated, it darkened and acquired an unpleasant burnt taste, becoming unfit for consumption. This required constant attention and experience from the person monitoring the cauldron. As the fat melted, cracklings floated to the surface, pieces of connective tissue from which all the fat had been rendered. They had to be constantly skimmed off with a slotted spoon to prevent them from burning. These cracklings were a favorite treat for children and an excellent addition to cornbread. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was put to good use. The liquid transparent fat was carefully strained through a cloth into prepared storage containers. This was the most crucial moment. It was necessary not to spill the precious liquid and not to burn oneself. Hot fat was more dangerous than boiling water, and accidents during cooking were not uncommon. Burn scars were a common mark on many housewives. As it cooled, the fat turned white and hardened, becoming the very product that saved people in winter. It was poured into tin cans, ceramic pots, or wooden tubs. The containers were tightly closed and stored in a cool place, away from light and mice. Well-rendered lard could be stored for over a year without losing its qualities. On this day, preparations were also made for soap from fat that was too dirty to eat. Leftovers, trimmings, fat from intestines, everything went into a separate pot for cooking technical fat. The savings were total because every animal was obtained through hard work. The day of the big cooking was a kind of celebration of the end of the season, a summing up of the year. The amount of fat prepared directly indicated how well-fed and warm the coming winter would be. A family with full barrels of lard could look to the future with confidence. The fatigue after such a day was incredible, but the feeling of a job well done overshadowed everything else. People washed themselves in bathhouses, washed their smelly clothes, and rejoiced at the result. It was the very routine of survival on which the entire life of the pioneers depended. For the tribes of the Great Plains and the pioneers who came into contact with them, the buffalo was the main source of fat. Buffalo fat had its own unique characteristics. It was harder than beef fat and had a yellowish tint.
I understand now.
The fat from the animal's hump and bone marrow were especially prized and considered a delicacy. The Indians taught white people how to use every drop of fat from this huge carcass. Extracting bone marrow was a special process. The bones were crushed with stones and boiled in water for a long time. The fat floated to the surface where it was collected and cooled. The result was so-called bone oil, which was very tender and tasty. It resembled butter and was used for eating in its pure form. The Indians stored the fat in cleaned animal bladders and stomachs, creating natural airtight containers. Pioneers were surprised to discover that fat stored in such containers did not spoil for months, even in the summer heat. This experience was adopted by hunters who needed to carry supplies over long distances. The lightness and durability of such containers were unmatched. Buffalo fat was mixed with dried bird cherry or urge berries to make a sweet paste. It was a kind of delicacy, an Indian dessert that provided energy and vitamins. For the children of settlers who had not seen candy for years, it was a real treat. The taste of the wild became familiar to new generations of Americans. Fat was also used for ritual purposes and for everyday needs, such as treating teepee skins. Skins soaked in fat and smoked over a fire became waterproof and soft. Indian dwellings and pioneer tents often smelled of a mixture of smoke and rancid fat. This smell was an integral part of the camp atmosphere. With the disappearance of the buffalo herds, an entire culture of consumption and use of their fat disappeared. Settlers had to switch to domestic livestock, but old hunters nostalgically remembered the taste of real lard. Buffalo fat became a legend, a symbol of a bygone era of wildlife abundance. However, the skills acquired from interacting with Native Americans remained and were applied to other animals. The ability to crush bones for oil saved many families during the hungry years of the Great Depression. Knowledge did not disappear, it transformed to suit new conditions. The interaction of cultures on the basis of survival gave rise to unique methods unknown in Europe. The American frontier became a melting pot not only of peoples, but also of survival technologies. And fat was the connecting element that everyone needed, regardless of skin color. Living on lean meat alone, such as rabbit, in winter could lead to a dangerous condition known as rabbit starvation. The human body cannot digest protein without sufficient fat and literally begins to eat itself. The pioneers knew that you could eat as much meat as you wanted, but without fat you would still weaken and die. Therefore, fat was not just an addition to food, but the main condition for the digestion of any food. The craving for fat in winter became unbearable, almost narcotic. People dreamed not of a piece of tenderloin, but of a thick layer of lard or a spoonful of butter. Travelers' diaries are full of entries about how they fantasized about fatty foods during long journeys. It was the voice of instinct demanding fuel to warm the body. The lack of fat affected the psyche, making people irritable, lethargic, and prone to depression. In closed communities during winter, this often led to conflicts and outbreaks of unmotivated aggression. The presence of a barrel of lard was a guarantee of not only the physical, but also the mental health of the group. A person who was well-fed and had received a portion of fat was calmer and kinder. Hunters often ate the fatty parts of their prey on the spot, leaving the lean meat behind. The liver, kidneys, and internal fat were the most coveted rewards after a successful shot. This behavior seems wild, but it was dictated by the wisdom of the body. Refusing fat in favor of muscle was considered a sign of inexperience, of being a greenhorn. The fear of running out of fat reserves forced people to take enormous risks in order to hunt large animals. Hunting bears before hibernation was a dangerous but necessary mission. A bear was a walking storehouse of fat, capable of providing for a family for the entire winter. A successful hunt was celebrated as the greatest event of the year. Even religious fasts were often exempted on the frontier, as adherence to a strict diet could cost lives. Priests understood the harsh conditions and turned a blind eye to the consumption of fat on days of abstinence. The survival of the flock was more important than adherence to canons written in warm countries. The understanding of the role of fats in the diet was intuitive, but absolutely correct from a scientific point of view. Pioneers discovered the laws of nutrition in extreme conditions through their own experience. They knew their bodies better than many modern doctors. The history of the conquest of the West is a history of the struggle for calories. And in this struggle, fat was man's main ally. Without understanding this simple biological truth, no amount of courage would have helped to conquer the continent. We see that ordinary animal fat was a real white gold for the pioneers, a universal material that permeated all areas of their lives, from lighting their homes to treating illnesses, from lubricating wheels to protecting their skin from the cold. Without this resource, survival on the frontier would have been impossible. It was a now forgotten feat of adaptation when people used the gifts of nature to the fullest, not allowing anything to go to waste. Their experience teaches us that in extreme conditions, the simplest things become the most valuable. Which use of fat did you find most surprising? Was it eating it raw to keep warm or using it to waterproof clothing? Please suggest topics for future videos about life in the Wild West that you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about survival on the edge of civilization.